Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Apologies for the late start. We've had a few more attendees than we had budgeted for, and we've had to upgrade the account. Um, but in the meantime, thank you very much for supporting Climate Governance Malaysia. Climate Governance Malaysia organized and participated in 37 events last year, making it a total of 45 events since it launched in May 2019. Today is the first in our series of primers on climate governance. The next primer will be on disclosure, and then climate ambitions of our trading partners, where we are collaborating closely with embassies to get their views. We are also planning for a series of roundtable engagements across multiple ministries and environmental NGOs to discuss climate ambitions, specifically net carbon zero targets by 2050, and this is scheduled to start next month. To protect our natural environment and biodiversity, we are also turning the spotlight on some great local NGOs who are doing terrific work. Our first showcase this year will be Life on Land, happening next Tuesday afternoon on 19th of January. Please sign up for this. Listen to them and decide for yourself how these hardworking and committed workers can be supported. There's a lot of work to be done, and we're reaching out to companies to invite them to support this initiative by signing up as corporate members. Why are we doing this? Firms are facing real physical risks and risks arising from the evolving regulatory landscape. There is growing urgency on the need for corporates to understand, to assess, and to disclose physical related climate risks and opportunities. The United Nations Environment Programme Emissions Gap Report, which was just released yesterday evening, reconfirms that we are not doing enough to cut greenhouse gas emissions and that adaptation needs to be a high priority. Based on Paris Agreement commitments, the world is heading for at least 3 degrees centigrade rise this century. It is clear developing countries will suffer the most, and it is also clear that these impacts will be most pronounced on the most vulnerable. So ensuring that companies are braced for these changes requires clear ownership within the organization and corresponding accountability. This is an investor and financial regulator expectation and will increasingly be an explicit regulatory requirement. Is this too difficult for a single director or a single company to do? Absolutely. The role of government is really important. For example, every organization in China is going to feel the need to develop a credible story of how it's getting to net zero, because that is now the stated climate ambition and policy by the president of the government. Aside from putting a price on carbon, no government that is serious about creating a decarbonized economy can do it without getting serious about mandatory disclosure. Investors as well have mobilized on a level that's never happened before in the history of the investment community. Asset managers might be one step removed, but they are one step ahead. They are looking at what companies are saying about their climate transition strategy, and they are assessing their credibility, both in terms of what they want to achieve in the next few decades and how they will achieve it. So we really need to have precision and discipline in how we are using these terms. Investors are clear. They are going to vote against directors. They want an accountability mechanism. They want to vote on the company's climate plan. They must have mandatory disclosure. Essentially, can you absolutely demonstrate very clearly the role that climate is going to play in your strategy and demonstrate how practically deliverable that is as a concept? And so directors have a responsibility to manage the risks of our business and investments, to ensure that we're very much fulfilling our responsibility in managing that risk, which will enable stakeholders to determine which companies are putting in place the strategies to transition. Today, it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to our non-executive directors who are championing this urgent cause. Keynotes will be delivered by Dr. Kalanithi Nesaretnam and Tunku Dr Alina, Alias. They will then be joined in a panel discussion by Sharmila Sekarajasekaran and Khor Yu Leng. We do recognize that we are gender challenged, and we are delighted that our moderator, also a big supporter of this initiative, has agreed to join us, Datuk Seri Johan Raslan. For now, I would like to invite Dr. Kala to deliver her keynote address. Thank you. Kala, you're muted.
Sorry. Thank you, Sunita, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. In my presentation this afternoon, I will cover the current climate crisis and the potential issues companies may face with regards to litigation and carbon tax. I will then move on to what companies can do and conclude with governance principles for board of directors. The 2020 World Economic Forum Global Risk Report highlighted that climate risks and biodiversity loss rank among the top 5 risks for businesses in the next 10 years in terms of likelihood and impact. I don't think I need to say more. Even as I speak, we are losing flora, fauna, and wildlife. We all know that as far as climate is concerned, we are in a state of emergency. 2020 has been a challenging year indeed, fighting the invisible COVID virus, which caught us all by surprise. But the bigger elephant in the room for which we don't have a vaccine is still climate change. The International Federation for Red Cross notes that more than 100 climate-related disasters occurred in just the first 6 months of the pandemic, affecting over 50 million people. 83% of all disasters triggered by natural hazards were caused by extreme weather and climate-related events such as floods, storms, droughts, and heat waves. Over the last decade, we have seen worsening climate effects, the melting glaciers in the Arctic, rising sea levels, floods in many countries, and fires in Australia and California. The current trajectory of elevated greenhouse gases is projecting a 2 to 4 degree rise in temperature. And we need a major turnaround in emissions trajectories across all sectors: power, industry, transport, buildings, steel, aviation, etc., if we want to meet the Paris Agreement. This figure shows in red the current trajectory, and in blue what needs to be done to be below 2 degrees centigrade. You can see there's an extremely significant gap here. With the pandemic, we saw an 8% reduction in GHG emissions, but to get back on target of 1.5 degrees, we need to reduce by 15.4%. But it is not all doom and gloom. What gives us hope is that if we collectively work towards addressing the crisis and limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, we can arrest this trend as long as we, as individuals, take responsibility in addressing the challenge in any way possible and advocate for positive initiatives from the government. We will be on the right track. Recent announcements by various countries for net carbon zero targets are encouraging, and we hope the stated goals will be achieved. Businesses, on the other hand, are a significant emitter of carbon emissions, and many companies which are not prepared for the climate emergency may go out of business or be punished by their stakeholders. And I'm quoting here the CEO of Unilever. Big investors like BlackRock have urged companies to maintain their focus on reducing carbon emissions, teaming up together through initiatives such as Climate Action 100+, amid growing concerns of an economic fallout from global warming. Partly in response to investor and customer pressure, businesses have begun making so-called net zero commitments, pledging to cut or offset emissions by taking an equivalent amount out of the atmosphere through carbon capture and other technologies. Companies including British Petroleum, Shell, Barclays, Nestle, DG, and the airline group IAG have all set net zero targets for 2050. It is also heartening to hear from our Malaysian corporations like Petronas, their aspirations. I am also a member of CIMB's CEO Action Network, and I'm happy to report that over 40 industry captains have come together to adopt best ESG practices. CGM is also working with Academy Sciences Malaysia to provide data to companies on what a 1.5-degree Malaysia will look like so they can take the necessary mitigation steps to prepare for this eventuality. Carbon taxes around the world, companies in the future may also be faced with enduring a carbon tax on goods exported to certain countries. Also, to date, 25 countries have started imposing a carbon tax on companies that emit greenhouse gases. EU, for example, which already has a binding target to cut greenhouse gases by at least 40% by 2030 from 1990 levels, wants to become climate neutral by mid-century under an unprecedented strategy called the Green Deal. The EU wants to ensure that imported goods makers face the same costs of emissions as European companies. A carbon border tax would penalize dirty imports from countries that lag behind in fighting climate change. Our neighbor Singapore, since 2019, has started a carbon tax of 5 Singapore dollars per ton of GHG emissions. The message is very clear. Reduce your emissions or pay the tax. Litigation pressure is also on the rise. Citizens and NGOs are suing to hold their governments accountable for climate-related commitments. As of January 2020, the total number of climate change cases filed in 33 countries is 1,444. This slide is about a Peruvian farmer who lives in Juarez, Peru. He filed a claim against RWE, Germany's largest electricity producer, in a German court. The farmer alleges that RWE, having knowingly contributed to climate change by emitting substantial volume of greenhouse gas emissions, bears some measure of responsibility for the melting of mountain glaciers near Juarez that supports a population of 120,000. He won the case, by the way. So what should companies do? In an informal survey of directors and management teams that we ran in August 2020, there was overwhelming demand for the type of content which CGM is providing to the business community, including the need for more detailed analysis for boards to make fully informed decisions about business strategy, future allocation of capital, how to smoothly transition from brown businesses, and insights into green opportunities. As a first step towards climate neutrality and resilience, public listed companies should take steps by measuring and disclosing 4 key areas, namely GHG emissions, transitioning to renewable energy, waste management, and water management. This slide illustrates IOI plantations setting clear targets in reducing their GHG emissions by 61% in 2025 from baseline levels in 2015, a good example of local companies taking action. Moving on to governance principles, the World Economic Forum launched the Initiative on Climate Change Targeting Non-Executive Directors of Boards from the Perspective of Governance. Decisions made at the board are more effective in steering companies to adopt best practices. The 8 core principles include climate accountability, subject command, board structure, materiality assessment, strategic integration, incentivization, reporting and disclosure and exchange. Board members should incorporate these principles into the short, medium, and long-term organizational strategies to ensure the viability of companies over the next few decades. So, last week we all saw BlackRock voting against the re-election of independent directors at Top Glove. With regards to their lack of care on labor issues, I think this was a clear signal and warning to all of us independent directors. Directors may in future be facing a similar trend in addressing climate accountability because we are responsible for the long-term resilience of the company. Failure to do so may constitute a breach of our duties. We have started with the public listed companies where we are directors, and we hope that soon we can report that others have come on board. Of course, our partners, Bursa and Securities Commission, are on the same page and are supportive of this initiative. Incidentally, New Zealand is the first country to make climate change reporting mandatory. I believe Bursa is also studying this and looking at how this can be adopted in Malaysia. So, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, a proactive stance on governance of climate change is now seen as consistent with financial wealth interests. Boards must actively engage with how the issue of climate change impacts on their operations, risk, and strategy. A passive approach to climate change may be inadequate to satisfy directors' duties of due care and diligence. So, ladies and gentlemen, we don't have a planet B. Well, not yet. So, let's all work together to ensure we have Mother Earth in a good place for our future generations. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your time. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Tunku Dr Alina Alias, who will enlighten us on ESG reporting standards. Alina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carla. That was a great talk. Good afternoon, friends. While I'm setting up my share screen, I just wanted to let you know that I have prepared a glossary and a reference, which is available for you to download together with my slides on CG Malaysia's website. So it's www.cgmalaysia.com. Go ahead and register and download, because there's quite a lot of references and links that you could use. I hope you can see my slides. So my topic is an overview of ESG reporting standards. And just to give a roadmap of my next 10 minutes with you, I'll be talking about why we're doing this and who's involved. Basically, the corporate purpose, the stakeholders, and the SDGs. How we intend to do this is reporting and disclosure, which is basically Principle 7 of the World Economic Forum's CG initiative. What it's all about is an alphabet soup of voluntary sustainability standards. When, about the journey as directors, how do we undertake it, and specifically about you as directors. So let's start about why and who. I guess the reason why I think this is important is really is no point talking about this unless we understand why we need to embrace ESG. So starting from late 19th century with separate corporate identity, corporate purposes back then was profit maximization. But it's since changed with society, and 50 years ago, through the Davos Manifesto, the World Economic Forum introduced a so-called novel concept at that time called the stakeholder. But then, 50 years later, under the Davos Manifesto 2020, they are now talking about stakeholder capitalism. So the question is, should a company go beyond profits for its shareholders to add value to society? So I guess what is then society's expectations? And the universal understanding today started out with the term sustainable development. And this was introduced to us in 1987, quite some time ago, which is based on intergenerational equity, i.e. meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And then since then, we've had the Millennial Development Goals, and then of course, the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, which is what we're talking about today. And the concept of ESG was introduced in 2004 through a report called Who Cares Wins, commissioned by the International Finance Corporation, which is part of the World Bank Group. And then in 2014, the United Nations Global Compact declared that corporate sustainability is an imperative. Therefore, today, as a citizen of the world, companies and businesses, both public and private, would align their activities to the SDGs in order to be seen as sustainable. And basically, these activities fall under 4 categories of EESG. And basically, we've come full circle. Back to our shareholders, our investors demand it. Of course, there are companies that do it, embrace or look to embrace ESG because they're sincerely aligned and feel responsible. There are others who do it because it gives them the social license to operate. And then yet others to do it because their investors demand it. And there are, of course, those that just pay lip service and hope nobody notices. Well, we're hoping to convert everybody into fully embracing ESG. So particularly sophisticated investors, for example, our institutional investors, they have the science and data to prove the direct correlation between a company that does well in ESG and its financial performance. I mean, not causation, but correlation. And in a way, it does reflect in the stock price. So how do we do this? How do we communicate with our investors? We do it through reporting and disclosures. Talking about Malaysia, there are 2 things. There are the shoulds and the nice-haves. If one were a public listed company, and even if one were not, you could refer to the document. And this is published by our Bursa Malaysia. The Malaysian Code of Corporate Governance talks about the G in the EESG. And then the Sustainability Reporting Guide talks about the EES. So those are the shoulds and the minimum that a company might want to look at in their reporting and disclosures. Of course, nice to haves are third-party rankings and ratings, or even being included in an index. So for example, CDP uses the TCFD framework, Refinitiv or Bloomberg. An index, for example, a Dow Jones Sustainability Index, FTSE for Good, FTSE Russell ESG, MSCI ESG indices. But these are nice to haves, and they can be expensive because most of these rankings and ratings are not free. So what is it all about? According to the standards map of the International Trade Centers, there are more than 270 sustainability standards in 600 product groups. And this covers 15 industries and 180 countries. And this results in more than 4,500 ESG KPIs. But they're all voluntary, and that's why they are termed voluntary sustainability standards, VSS in short. They incorporate frameworks, standards, audit protocols, codes of conduct, etc., etc. Some are developed for reasons such as accreditation, or for certification by third-party providers, or for verification. But all of them have one sole purpose, i.e., the provision of SDG-related data in relation to the company's activities. So to make it easy, if you were a director thinking, oh my goodness, which of these should apply to my company? It's basically categorized into 3. Universal VSS, industry-related VSS, and topical. So if we went to a universal VSS would apply across industries. You would look to the Global Reporting Initiative, which is referred to by Bursa Malaysia. And for those who are concerned about their institutional investors, the Principles of Responsible Investment also has a pretty good framework. Now, as directors, if you more or less look into these 2, and you have the links that I've shared with you, those would cover quite a bit of the universal aspects that you might need to know. And then, of course, it's industry related. So it depends on your industry. For example, agribusiness. The agribusiness sector has the most number of VSS. Example, the palm oil industry with its RSPO, MSPO, and ISPO. MSPO is Malaysian, ISPO is Indonesian, and RSPO is international. Then if you were into forestry, then you're talking about the Forest Stewardship Council or PFC, even the Malaysian Timber Corporation certification. If you were in banking, you would look at B&M's exposure document on climate change and principle-based taxonomy. So it really depends on the industry, but choose one according to your industry. Lastly is topical VSS. This depends on what topics that you think your company should or might be interested in. So for example, if you were in manufacturing and you have a lot of laborers or workers, you might be interested in those that relate to human and labor rights, like SMITA or BSCI. Or if you're interested in climate-related topics, like GHGs, decarbonization, deforestation, indirect land use change, you would refer to the task force on climate-related financial disclosures, TCFD for short, or even the Science-Based Targets Initiative. In 2020, SBTI framework has actually come up for guidance for financial institutions covering their lending portfolios. So let's say you're ready and you want to begin the journey. What would you need to do? Two things. First, you have to assess your company's maturity and acceptance level. So basically judge from the conversations that you have with the CEO and management, as well as with your fellow board directors. Where is the company on the maturity curve? Is it just anecdotal? Are we at basic level? Are they already competitive? Are they advanced, or are they leaders? In which case, if they're leaders, then your job is easy. And then the question about internal acceptance and adoption levels. Are they just aware? Are they beginning to learn? How is their understanding? Are their acceptance level? Are they committed? So once you've determined their maturity and acceptance level, you'd want to begin to introduce and engage. And I think in this aspect, some EQ and communication skills might be involved, and also generational differences. Why I say this is because I found that if you have a lot of young people in the workforce and management, it makes it a bit easier. And also, if the CEO is convinced, it also makes your work a lot easier. And how you would do this is you could ask questions during board deliberations, you undertake director trainings, or you could actually ask for director trainings yourself and have it done at board level. When you sign off on your sustainability reporting, these are some questions you could put to them. And then during your KPI setting, during the strategy sessions, you could also introduce sustainability standards and questions. So, as an INET, you basically have strategic and accountability oversight. And you would try to provide a materiality map, use the SDG goals to identify issues, report against an ESG VSS of your choice. Don't forget to include climate change and use TCFD for that. The most difficult part, I think, is gathering the data, ESG related data. And don't forget to join us. So that's it. Thank you very much for your time. I'd like to invite Datuk Seri Johan Raslan to moderate our panel discussion, and our panelists, Ms. Khor Yu Leng and Ms. Sharmila Sekarajasekaran. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Tunku Dr Alina. Assalamualaikum and very good morning, afternoon. Everybody. I'd like to thank very much Dr. Kala and Tunku Alina for those great great presentations to start us off this afternoon. With me now are also the panelists Sharmila Sekarajasekaran and Khor Yu Leng. Please, I invite them to switch on their cameras as well, so we are almost all here. And come back in, Dr. Alina, when you can. To kick off, maybe I could just invite Sharmila and Khor Yu Leng to comment on the keynotes that we've just heard from Kala and Alina. So who's going to start? Sharmila?
Sure. Thank you so much, Datuk Seri Johan, and good afternoon, and thank you to all of you participants for joining us this Friday afternoon. Both Kala and Alina have spoken quite passionately and eloquently about the need for climate governance action at the board level, and they've also provided some practical ideas. What is very clear is that different companies and the different industries in Malaysia are at different stages of awareness and action, both in totality. There is a growing need to enhance climate expertise at the board level. So it's wonderful that all of you have been interested enough to join us, and we really hope we'll be able to impart some level of knowledge that you can take back with you. But the first question perhaps is, why should we as board members be concerned? And I would just like to make three observations from what both Kala and Alina have shared earlier. And the first is economic accountability. We know that increasingly investors, consumers are increasingly interested in the issue of climate governance. And it is very important for boards of companies to understand how climate risks may affect the companies, and to be able to be better informed and to make more strategic decisions in this regard. There's certainly something that investors are looking at. Carla's pointed out BlackRock. And in fact, the CEO, Larry Fink, if I can remember his quote in his recent letter in 2020, who said that we will be increasingly disposed to vote against management and board of directors when companies are not making sufficient progress on sustainability related disclosures and the business practices and processes and plans underlying them. So it is clear that investors are seeking to understand both the physical risks associated with climate change, but also in the ways that climate policy will impact the pricing, costs, and the demand across entire economies. So he talked about climate risk leading to fundamental reshaping of finance. So there's a very sound economic reason as to why we need to start thinking about this very seriously. We also know that as the millennials come up and start becoming more vocal in their buying choices, their purchasing choices, they too are going to be looking at climate-related environmental issues and also climate-related issues. So they're going to start voting with their pocket, with their cash, maybe not necessarily as shareholders, but definitely with the dollar. There's also a legal responsibility, and there is an increasing trend, as Kala shared, towards requiring boards to report on and disclose risks due to climate change. Directors, we all know, have a fiduciary obligation to be informed about and to act on and disclose all matters which affect continuity and sustainability of the company of which they're board members. And this is increasingly going to include disclosure on risks and opportunities associated with climate change. The recommendations of TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, already encourages that companies need to disclose how they govern climate change risk, carbon emissions, emission intensity, as well as the metrics and targets, and that the company should disclose the board's role in climate change risk management. So really, there's a huge legal obligation being imposed on the board and on the directors personally. And I'd also like to highlight one other point, and that is the distinction between CSR, corporate social responsibility, versus sustainability or corporate sustainability. Corporate sustainability, which usually falls under the broader term of environmental social governance, is different. It talks about a new corporate management model or system, which is different to corporate social responsibility, CSR, which really is about a company being socially accountable, not just to itself, but also to stakeholders in the public. So usually, when we talk about CSR, it's about a company that looks backward and reflects on what it has done and how it has contributed to society, whereas sustainability, corporate sustainability, looks forward and talks about how it has developed sustainable strategies for the future. The targets of CSR initiatives are usually opinion formers like the media and politician and activists, pressure groups, whereas corporate sustainability looks at the whole value chain from cradle to cradle, everyone from the end consumer to its stakeholders, to its suppliers. It looks at everyone within its value chain and supply chain. So really, sustainability emphasizes on business growth, profitability through intentional business practices in these three areas of society. And the goal is to provide long-term value for stakeholders without compromising the three values of people, planet, and economy. So really, it's less about greenwashing and more about creating fundamental structural change with corporate sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sharmila. Yu Leng, some brief comments on what we heard earlier.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. And thanks to the CGM crew for all their hard work on this. And obviously I'm part of this group as well. It's been an exciting look at how we can practically move ahead, I think, on real actions on the emergency issues, which have been very clearly highlighted by Kala. I think I want to re-emphasize what she has pointed out, that you really have to have some measurables, right? I mean, you have to have your GHG, your carbon, your water, your energy, your wastes. I mean, there has to be some accountability on those measures. I'd like to highlight that aspect of what Kala has talked about within the overall context, because, really, if you can't measure something, how are you going to be accountable to it, and how are you going to target reduction? So I think that's a very fundamental aspect of what we're looking at. And also what Alina has done, I think, is a wonderful overview of, what you should be looking at. You have this issue that Bursa is encouraging the reporting. Of course, we know that the reporting right now is, very quite varied in quality. But, there's that example of, say, what IOI has moved on as an interesting example from one of the big corporates here. And, that covers this global GRI, and then PRI is something that you might feel from your investors. So I would think about things as, what do you have to do on your supply chain as given your position in the value chain for your sector or sectors? And also consider what your banker might be asking you to do. I know at this time it's a little bit uncertain because, say if we look at the plantation example, I did share in the group chat a link to a piece that I was part of the team at SIIA working on, and we did a lot of interviews for that. And so, you get the answer that, oh yes, I mean, the banks are asking you to do, say, if your plantation, they want you to do roundtable on sustainable palm oil, but then you get the anecdotes that actually the bankers are really desperate to lend right now. So even the Guaylo banks, the foreign banks, are not asking for these standards right now, or at least the salespersons are not, because they're trying to hit their targets. And these commodity sectors are so bankable at this point. So there's a lot of, reality checks about these things. And then what are your investors asking you for? Again, Alina has presented a good range of things. And I think in terms of investors, you have to see who are your key investors, because are you going for FTSE or Dow Jones sustainability? It really depends on where the investor interest in your company stock is being held. And you may then have to comply on one or two, whether, because some are like, you know, North America oriented, some are Europe oriented, and it's very confusing mass of things right now. And, you know, as pointed out, 4,500 ESG KPIs. If you're a big company, you know, you might be pulled many ways. And I might then venture to suggest that we really should look at what a mid-sized company can do in Malaysia. I think that is the real benchmark that we need, because the big companies can theoretically afford to do everything. Well, not everything, but, you know, within reason. But what can we do for the mid-sized company out there? And this is where I do kind of suggest, touching on what Carla said about these measurables and what Alina said, we have Malaysian initiatives which are not even utilized very well right now. How many of your companies have a green building index, right? How many of your factories have the green factory index certification done? There are Malaysian standards on that. I'm not going to sneeze at it, but because you have to start somewhere. Have you looked into it? Have you checked out whether there's tax advantages to use those? Should we be lobbying for it? There should be priority sectors. Those of you exporting are obviously under the radar, because whether you're selling to the EU, whether you're selling to Australia, they have modern slavery requirements. They can stop your cargo, and you'll probably have to start reporting on carbon as well. So, you know, although I recognize that CCFD and all that are very good, I think it's a little bit more high level, but I think the practicality is, how are you going to compete selling your product if Indonesian exporters are starting to present the data? If Vietnam is forcing its export sector to report across all these things. So please take it very seriously. And, you know, okay, maybe you're skeptical about the climate aspect, or you think it's going to take some time. But what I warn is that your competitors may be moving faster than you think. I have seen wonderful examples of mid-sized companies, Malaysian ones as well, who become, this is the palm oil sector, a mid-sized company, not the big public listed one, mid-sized company getting the top European clients and getting the top premiums for their sustainability product. It's not the big guys, I'm sorry to say. It's the mid-sized, nimble exporters who are going to get ahead and get those clients. Indonesia as well. I've seen mid-sized companies run streets ahead. They've just gone ahead. They've just gone with the certification, and they've grabbed the grade A customers. So I think this is a real commercial imperative as well. So I do encourage people to look at the positives of this to grab market share and to find that potential there. There is the reality and also the burning competition of this.
Thank you very much, Yu Leng. Now, what I'm going to do, ladies and gentlemen, is to ask a couple of questions, my own, to the panelists. I'll direct it to individual panelists, so in the interest of time, not everybody has to answer. But if panelists wished, you're really burning interest in answering, then interrupt and so on. Then I will be moving as soon as I can to questions from the floor. That's in the Q&A box. Please put it in there, not so much in the chat box. Easier for me to get to them. So can I kick off with some of the other questions I've got in my mind? Dr. Kala, at the end of the day, are there any companies in Malaysia which, in your view, can truthfully say, climate change, climate emergency, whatever, that doesn't apply to us? So there's nothing we need to do about it. Are there any companies out there that you can think of that maybe climate emergency does not apply to?
Thank you, Johan, for that question. Well, as far as I'm concerned, I can only answer for the company that I sit on, and I think we have no issues at our board. There's a fantastic buy-in, so I can say very confidently that because at the end of the day, it's individuals on the companies that drive this, and if we can get the management and the CEO and the directors to all engage, I don't really see any issue here. Well, this is just coming from my perspective, which is looking at what's happening in the company that I'm with. Hope that answers the question, Johan.
Anybody else? Sharmila?
Yeah, no, what I was going to say is that I think, all of us here have got boards which are already slightly aware, if not further along the road, more mature in terms of awareness. But I'm sure that there are many companies, and we hear of a number of people who talk about the fact that, it's all a hoax, it's a climate hoax. It's not real, it's not going to happen. The environment will heal itself and things like that, So I'm sure there are naysayers on boards, and I'm sure there are boards which really have not come along on this journey at all. So, the only message really to them is that we have already seen, like I said, investors have already made the clarion call. They are going to start looking at sustainable reporting. They're actually going to dig deep and expect figures and facts and assessment. As Yu Leng pointed out, and Alina as well, maybe not all the information in terms of standards and reporting is there, but it's certainly happening. We do know that certainly the big accounting firms are on board in terms of doing this kind of audit. So, I think it's something that we're going to see very much a part of our reporting and how we have to report. So, they can say, no, it's not going to happen and wait, but I fear that it may be too late once they're ready. Are they able to adapt fast enough? And most likely not.
And thank you very much. And very interesting what Yu Leng also said about SME companies kind of perhaps being a bit more nimble and getting into this and taking advantage in a way of all the problems that Alina pointed out, kind of turning it to their advantage. I just want to ask a little bit about the the nuts and bolts of some of this. Some companies, many companies are quite complex, and they don't just manufacture everything and it's all of their own. So, but they are judged upon stuff which perhaps, like in the case of that comes in from their counterparties and their customers, from the suppliers. For example, I think we alluded a palm oil company that uses FFB and from elsewhere, and or even a bank which lends to let's say a coal-fired plants, energy plants, etc. How far does a company have to look? Is it just itself, or is it its complete supply chain? And what are the risks there? I don't know who might be wanting to tackle this one. Maybe Kala Yu Leng. Don't all rush.
I could touch on it quickly. I mean, if you talk about GHG, there is scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. Basically, to cut the long story short, you should look into it. But broadly speaking, scope 3 is about your supply chain. So it's the last, as it were, the last thing. Scope 1 is to really get your own house in order, right? I mean, I was talking to a great mid-sized company. It's not going to be, I suppose it's not going to be highlighted as a champion, but I think it is because, it's looking at strengthening its factory roof to put in solar panels. So they're shifting more to renewable energy. So I think these are our real Malaysian champions out there who are quietly doing stuff. I'm afraid to be a bit contrarian on the big companies, because I think what has happened is that they've gotten caught up in a lot of these voluntary sustainability schemes, which don't have any measurable accountabilities. And these are being, people are taking shots at that, because it's very hard to explain that, I have this label, but what's in it, right? And if you're a mid-sized company and you run straight into measurable accountability, I venture to think you're going to get ahead of these big boys. So, as in all things, move ahead, move fast. Maybe these are things that social media would understand, because social media doesn't seem to understand. Plantations, for instance, has been doing sustainability for yonks. I mean, I've been covering it for, 12 years. They seem to have done a lot, but they haven't convinced people. And of course, I'm very biased because I like accountability and data. And I would think that if you're a smaller, nimble player and you go in with the measurable accountability, I think the young people will start to listen to you. The problem is the young people don't believe what a lot of plantations are saying, and that's even locally, right? So that's your social media part, much less overseas. And then on the other hand, if you have a regulator like US Customs and Border Patrol that says that there's all these NGO reports, there's all these AFP, press reports that say that you have, the S part, right? The social part is a problem. But then you don't have metrics to show that these problems are 1% of a 1% incidence rate. How are you going to convince regulators? So I do challenge the mid-sized sector and sectors which can get together and act together to really move and get ahead so that you can export, your export markets are going to stay open, even, or even stay ahead of these export challenges. And for the domestic ones, you might be a little bit more laid back, but I think if you can get all your Malaysian certifications done, whether it's my GAP for good agricultural practices or the green building, please do that, because you have to start, and why not start this year? Thanks.
Johan, can I just add on
Yes,
from the palm oil sector perspective, because the company that I'm with, we get the FFB mainly from smallholders. I mean, 70% of our crop comes from smallholders. So then you will ask, how do you, maintain traceability, etc. So these small farmers, thank God, we now have MSPO, which is mandatory. It's not, on a voluntary basis. And as you know, the country, I think 80% of the country is now MSPO certified. But as the company that's buying in the crop as well, we also have, we are looking into how we can also provide guidance and assist the smallholders in complying with certification. And just to add on to what Yu Leng said, I think, as far as the current certifications are concerned, like RSPO, I think it's the highest standards. And on the 3rd of March, we are running a webinar where, we are talking about progressing from sustainability to climate action. And we are showcasing what Nestle in Malaysia is doing, meaning that looking at the entire supply chain, the traceability of the entire supply chain using satellite imaging. So this is the highest standards that are coming on, and RSPO, as much as people might want to complain, I think it's the highest standards for any vegetable oil out there. So I think we also need to encourage our plantation companies that these standards, just engage, do it, and the customers need to buy certified sustainable palm oil. I think that's the only way we can maintain the plantation sector in our country. And yeah, thank you.
Right. Look, our questions are coming in thick and fast from the audience. I'm going to try and address them. Ladies and gentlemen, don't worry. If your question is not addressed, we will be attempting to answer them on the website later. So Dr. Wei Chen, energy transition involves investment in renewable energy, most often solar pumps in the Malaysian context. However, returns on this type of investment are low and can erode the blended yield of a company's assets. How does a company manage this type of risk and prevent exodus of shareholders and collapse of the share price? Or doom and gloom there? Who's going to tackle that one? So the potential costs of actually, in the short term, addressing a long-term or medium or long-term issue of climate change. Dr. Waini, it's a sign of a good question when people are not rushing to answer your question.
Well, yeah, maybe I'll attempt this.
Yep.
So Yu Leng and I had the pleasure of visiting this massive solar farm up north, and it was really, really impressive. But we also understood that the capital investments that went in was huge, and returns on that type of business could be late in coming in. And I think if one were an investor into this type of business, you would need to understand that you cannot compare it against a different type of business where the returns would come in almost immediately. So a question of horizon is very important. But then sophisticated investors will already know this, and they will already understand this. Okay, so from the perspective of a consumer, if I were a company that's consuming solar energy, renewable energy, I'm not quite sure. Personally, I don't have that information. And this is one of those things that I think is challenging to many of the companies that I serve, which is data. And keeping data, especially in Malaysia, it's a bit hard. And as Carla said, traceability is another issue. So it's fine and well talking about disclosures, talking about measurements and metrics. It's all there. But in actual fact, trying to implement it, it is a real challenge. So while you say, yes, I'm using renewable energy, it's very difficult to prove the benefits of it. Yeah, so that's my personal view.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's stick to one answer per question. We can get a lot in. There's a couple of questions. I'm going to blend them together. One from Noripa. You put it in the wrong place, Noripa, but never mind. I have found it, along with Evelyn Chi. How far? So basically, what is Malaysian government doing? And shouldn't government be leading on this in many ways, including, and Evelyn is asking, what about the implementation of carbon tanks? These are kind of things that we in companies can't do, but government can. Who is going to tackle this?
Johan, can I answer Evelyn's question on carbon tax, please?
Yep.
So we were at ISIS, and they have been given the job of looking at carbon pricing in our country. So we were, at the roundtable discussion. So this is happening, and I can also tell you that we engage with CASA, with the Deputy Secretary General of CASA. This is our Ministry of Water and Environment, and he said that they are also looking, in fact last year they promised us that they would have a policy paper coming out soon, but this hasn't happened. But nevertheless, I think carbon taxes will be coming out pretty soon. Thank you, Johan.
Sorry, I muted myself for a second there. Okay, what about other ways in which government can, Yu Leng, has government already done enough to set us on the road? Is it now up to companies, or can government actually do more? So we've discussed carbon tax. Anything else that can be done? Yeah. What about subsidy for solar panels, all that kind of stuff that I've seen in other countries?
Yeah, I think that's the interesting aspect that, in all practicality, probably what we all should be looking at, very soon, if not, getting your management to look into it. I think the point that, what Sharmila said, that, well, I'm not saying that this is the management in every company, but, there is a tendency to talk about it as CSR. But I think what we need to do is give management small bite-sized things to look into, like this green building index stuff, right? I mean, I understand there has been some tax credits. Is it still available? I mean, that's my immediate question. And in fact, this afternoon, I'm going to find out. It's that urgent, I feel, because we need to get into these measurables, right? And I think in terms of solar and RE, it's quite interesting because I think the Pakatan guys weren't very keen on carbon tax. They kind of shoved it down the road, but maybe the new government might look into it. But, when you start your carbon measurements, also consider the fact that, whether, $1 or $5, which is how it's likely to start, is that enough? Because the literature says that it should be $50 or $100. So I think companies should build this into their scenario, because then you should plan how you do your carbon offsets and how your factory is powered, because this could affect your product carbon indicators and measurements. And whether, if you're doing, say, CSR, can you get into a real substantive project that's going to give you carbon offsets? And I think this is going to be the challenge for the NGO sector in Malaysia, because we may have a lot of people who are well-intentioned, good projects, which then companies may jump into for CSR reasons. But I would urge that we also need measurable projects which then can deliver carbon offsets. So it's not just the corporate sector that has to get moving. It's also the NGOs and civil societies who are obviously very keen to promote projects, but do they have a timeline for creating carbon offsets for this? Because I'm looking at this, I'm afraid, in a very hard-nosed way, because when management is going to decide on something, it's got to have some cost return on this. Because, you know, even on climate, you know, I think the reality is companies are going to look at cost benefit. So I think the cost benefit lens still has to apply. And absolutely, like what Tunku Alina said, you know, the solar is very costly. Ironically, actually, Malaysia has very high cloud cover. We're very near the equator. The best places for solar are actually Indochina. So what I would actually encourage is, maybe you should get very friendly with a palm oil mill, because maybe that's where we should be pushing policy. Palm oil mills can produce renewable energy. If you put your factory next to them, can all of you be very happy with great carbon offsets? Is there potential in that? Because that's a lot of RE, which policymakers have disregarded and gone for this easy solar, which has its problems, both in terms of ROI and the energy yields and everything. So I think we need a very practical think on these issues.
Okay. Yu Leng mentioned a lot about metrics and measurable outcomes and so on, as opposed to sort of the woolly CSR type of stuff. And Chin Yuk Sang has mentioned how to measure a PLC has successfully integrated sustainability. How does a PLC measure that it has successfully integrated sustainability in its objectives and strategy? And also, Kang Song mentioned that there are the 17 sustainable development goals. I'm going to touch upon them. For example, can we use this as a starting point for engaging investors? And would it be imperative to use these to force the management and boards to demand a clear roadmap on how this is to be achieved within a certain date? So these questions are about how PLCs can actually measure that they have successfully integrated sustainability into all that they do, and then also the UN 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. Who's keen to tackle integrated, I suppose, reporting and so on? Come on, we must be brave here, panel.
Okay, I'll attempt that. I'll attempt
yes,
that. Okay.
Good.
Okay. So first of all, I think it's a question of pricing, right? You price carbon, you price sustainability issues into your products, into your activities. When you start pricing these things into your activities and your products, the question that begs is that, are there returns on this? And at the end of the day, it all translates into dollars and cents. I think a lot of data crunching has to go on in order to actually quantitatively prove that sustainability or being mindful of sustainability is economically good for the company. It makes a good business case. And institutional investors like BlackRock, they have their own proprietary platform called Aladdin, and they have been able to number crunch and come up with reports to actually prove that companies that perform well with ESG, again, it's not causation, but correlation. Companies that perform well with ESG have also performed well financially. And in association with another group called Rhodium Group, I think you all can Google this. Otherwise, email CGM and I'll try to share the articles. But there has been quite a number of research that shows that correlation between companies that do well with ESG and that do well financially. Now, as to whether a company, how do you measure the company's sustainability efforts? I think in that case, what we've seen is that companies, they go through the framework. You choose a framework, for example, the GRI framework. And within that framework, they give you the procedure. First of all, you have to assess your benchmark, where you are, have an audit. Where's your benchmark? Where is your target? So basically, because it's voluntary, it's a lot to do with where you want to go. And CEOs will sometimes come out and pledge the company to a particular target. So in that sense, you yourself internally measure that, and in your report, you disclose that you have attained SDG 1, SDG 17, etc., etc. So again, it's all voluntary. However, investors have their own proprietary platform and they do their own investments. They do their own assessments on whether you're a good enough company to invest in. I'm not sure, whether that helps at all.
Well, yeah, actually, we've also got a helpful comment in the chat section about using blockchain, and maybe people can take a look at that link as well if they are interested in that. I want to change gears, a little bit, because we're getting into this realm as though we are managing the company. Let's go back and say many of us are actually directors of companies. We are not hands-on managing. We are one step removed, and we are influencing and overseeing, etc. We have final responsibility, but we're not going and doing the stuff generally. What about the this one? I'd like to hear something about personal journeys that you have gone through. Managements and other board members are not automatically predisposed towards, you mentioned carbon, and they also, or rather climate change. Oh yes, let's all do it. Surely there's pushback, and what pushbacks, what has been a bit harder from your experience when you have tried to raise it? Is there general indifference? How do you get climate change kind of on the agenda in your companies? Not everybody, but one or two of you. Any experiences there, and what arguments perhaps have you used? What tactics have you used? Maybe Alina. I think from our conversation earlier, you had a couple of things, and maybe Sharmila as well.
Okay, I'll start it off. So a lot of times it depends, right? Like I said, it depends on who you're engaging. There are some companies where the CEOs are on board, so your job's easy. And then there's some companies where the CEO is on board, but the chairman is not on board. So outwardly, during our conversation over lunch, CEO will not come out and say, yes, yes, yes. But privately, he'll come and say, actually, I agree with you, but I can't come out and say that because, chairman's not agreeable. But, so the question is, how do you as a director engage with your chair, and how do you think you can convince him? And inevitably, I think it all depends on your EQ and how you assess your relationship. So in terms of management's pretty straightforward. Some CEOs don't believe. But if you have a chair that believes, then your job's easy again, because then the board will say, no, you've got to pay attention to this. This goes into your KPI. So that's easier. So yeah, that's a high level experience. Yeah.
Thank you. Sharmila, what about, let's say, structural things one can do within the corporate governance framework of your company? For example, is there a part of the board or committee which is tasked with looking at climate change? Most terms of reference are silent on it if you look at all your committees on the board. Sharmila, what do you think?
Absolutely. I mean, and that's the thing, that it's a fairly new area that people are looking at. And, most boards are looking at the more business as usual, shorter term goals in terms of company planning. So it's how do we get people to put on a slightly longer lens, which climate issues relate to. There are different things that can be done. The first thing is really to get other advocates, other people who are similarly minded. It might require a certain amount of, like Alina says, using EQ, having those side conversations with other board members, independent directors, with other people in management, and basically getting one or two supporters on your side so that when you do raise issues, it gains more traction. There are many more voices speaking up on the same issue or highlighting concerns. Traditionally, something like this really should be looked at from a risk management perspective, from the board risk committee. It would also involve audit committee, but what could be useful also is if companies are able to set up separate committees to look at these issues. For example, a sustainability committee, which kind of melds together the risk aspect and the audit aspect. And I need to say that the internal audit is really important here. So it's important for the interplay between the different board committees. risk audit, and if there is a sustainability committee or a climate change committee, it's important to bring the three committees together at some level to assess the risk, to conduct the audits, and you need to speak to these people at the management level as well to ensure that they know and understand, for example, the internal auditor, that he knows and understands the matrix and the standards that need to be assessed and audited, quite apart from engaging with external auditors on this.
Right.
Johan, can I just quickly share some
Kala,
personal,
yes.
Personal experience? I think from my experience at the board, it wasn't difficult to persuade the board, that climate change needed to be addressed, but it was more difficult to fund and implement some necessary changes in years when the results were not ideal. So I think this was one of the drawbacks from my experience at my board. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, time is really not our friend today. And so we're really coming to the end of our time. We're really sorry about the questions not answered. M.R. Chandran, excellent question about climate change campaigners, etc., taking people, governments and companies to court. Maybe we can answer that online and others. Thank you very much for that. I want to ask the panelists just one by one to give a very briefly a one-liner that you just want to say your parting shot to the honorable audience here today. And if we just go around the table, in my screen, it looks this way. Khor Yu Leng, how about it? Your one-liner, yes.
Well, start tomorrow with practical small steps. I'm very positive on that there are things which are being overlooked. Let's not talk at too high a level and let's just get moving. Sorry, more than one line.
Just there are only two lines. Sharmila, or three. Sharmila, a one-liner.
So I would just encourage everyone to join CGM. There's a lot of resources available that we are able to share. And we're all on a journey together. So, by joining CGM, we can all learn from each other, best practices, and we are fortunate enough to also have international experts who are willing to speak to us and give guidance. So that's a plug for CGM, but it's a very real and practical thing that you can do if you're not quite sure how to, my board, if you have a personal story, my board is particularly difficult in this manner. We can actually brainstorm and come up with ideas as to how you can actually get climate change on the board agenda and get support in this.
Thank you. I'm not sure how many lines that was, but excellent points there, Sharmila. Thank you very much. Dr. Kala, you are muted. You are still muted.
Sorry. Okay. Thank you, Johan. So I think, let's not play the blame game. Let's get started. We should have started yesterday. So let's all get on climate action as soon as possible because we have a crisis in our hand. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Tunku Alina.
Have an informed mind and a courageous heart and be totally unapologetic.
Right. Well, excellent. Thank you very much. I think I'll just wind it up now, if I may, with everybody's permission. It's clear to me after listening to all of this, my colleagues here today, that it is clear that climate change or climate emergency, some of us would prefer to call it, is no longer something we're going to get to later when we have time. It's something we have to get to now. The Unilever chief executive, as Kala mentioned, says that climate change is the most pressing issue of our time. And when we're doing COVID, it's probably hard. Sometimes we lose sight of that. Dr. Kala has shown how that view is now firmly entrenched in the eyes of regulators, governments, large companies, and indeed, we haven't really mentioned here, our children, the younger people that are working and coming up. There is no planet B, she says. We and the companies under our stewardship are all exposed, as we have seen, to climate risk. Our stakeholders trust that we're aware of the magnitude of this risk and are taking steps to manage it. And we mustn't break that trust. Tunku Dr Alina has introduced us all to the range of standards and regulations out there. It's quite a frightening range, really, when you look at it there, that await us and the companies under our purview. It certainly looks kind of daunting to me, anyway, from where I'm sitting. But people, all of us, need to get to grips with this world. In our discussion with our excellent panelists, Sharmila and Yu Leng, we've heard more about the role of directors as well. And in the past, in the past, directorship may have been like for older guys like me, so a badge of honor and risk-free, even in the old days. Unfortunately, no more. We need to work harder to fulfill our fiduciary duties at this time when climate change is on our board and management agendas, or should be. It's also clear to me, listening to the discussion, that we are beyond the era of glossy show-off stuff in our annual reports and our sustainability reports. We are going to be asked questions, difficult questions, when we meet investors. And the same goes, horrors of horrors, in our AGMs, where there's nothing between us and the stakeholders. Stakeholders, both outside and inside our companies, are going to be reading all this stuff that we write with a critical eye and holding us all to account. And remember, share prices can go down as well as up. But it's not all doom and gloom, right? As Sharmila said, there are experts out there to call upon who can help. Indeed, we can help each other. And this is not just not in the traditional Malaysian way of denying it all. Help us by getting companies and CEOs to share the great practices that we have. Sectors like SMEs, as Khor Yu Leng mentioned, may well be leading the way and reaping the benefits because they are nimble and they don't have legacy infrastructure and thinking to burden them. Tax breaks may be available, and hey, you just got to go and ask for them, lobby for them. And lastly, of course, Climate Governance Malaysia is here to help. Join us and get more knowledge, and we will all increase our knowledge and help each other more. Meet experts and others in your position, so we don't all have to reinvent the wheel from the ground up. Take advantage of the experiences of others. Okay, please join me in thanking Climate Governance Malaysia. Thank you very much for this session today. And Datuk Seri Sunita Rajakumar introduced us for bringing us today together to share and to learn. And please also thank our 4 erudite keynoters and panelists, Dr. Kalanithi Nesaretnam, Tunku Dr Alina, Alias, Sharmila Sekarajasekaran, and Khor Yu Leng. And lastly, you don't see her, for skillfully operating the controls behind the scenes and cracking the whip on all of us. I have the scars to show it. I would like to thank Dr. Y.Y. Leong as well from CGM. It's traditional to have a quote at these things, and no better person to quote than the most famous 18-year-old in the world, Greta Thunberg. I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day. I want you to act. I want you to act like you are in a crisis. I want you to act like your house is on fire, because it is. Assalamualaikum, and very good afternoon, ladies, gentlemen, and friends. Thank you.
I think ladies and gentlemen, I think before we close, I would like to highlight 3 upcoming webinars. On 19th January, we have Life on Land, Conservation Efforts in Malaysia, where we are showcasing 3 NGOs doing excellent work in protecting some iconic species. On 11th February, at the request of the Institute of Investors Council, we are organizing a webinar, Understanding Increasing Investor Expectations for Climate Governance. And on 3rd of March, one specifically for the palm oil industry, entitled Progressing from Sustainability to Climate Action in the Palm Oil Sector. Do please, everybody, sign up. The information is available on our website. With that, thank you very much for your time and for joining all of us. Goodbye.